Sign it, Adrian Voss said, sliding the document across the chapel altar like it was a business transaction, not a marriage certificate. You're my wife on paper, nothing more. Don't forget that. Alaina's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The chapel was empty. No guests, no flowers, no music, just rain hammering the windows and the cold, flat weight of his stare. She had worn her mother's pearl earrings, thinking it might feel like something. It didn't. He didn't even look at her face. He looked at his watch. She signed. And the moment the ink dried, Adrian Voss pocketed his copy and walked straight out the door without a word, without a backward glance, without even waiting for her to stand. That was her wedding night. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow every single part of this story with me to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what happened after that signature nobody saw coming. Not even Adrian Voss. The town car smelled like leather and money. Alaina sat pressed against the door, watching the city blur past the rain-streaked window. Her white dress feeling less like a gown and more like a costume she hadn't auditioned for. The driver didn't speak. The partition was up, and Adrian Voss sat on the opposite end of the back seat with a phone to his ear, his voice low and controlled, talking about shipping routes and offshore accounts like he hadn't just gotten married 40 minutes ago. She studied him without meaning to. He was younger than she'd expected. Early 40s maybe, though there was something about the way he held himself that made him feel older. Sharp jaw, dark hair swept back, a tattoo curling up the right side of his neck like smoke from something that had burned a long time ago. His suit was immaculate. His face gave nothing away. She pulled her gaze back to the window. "You can stop staring," he said, not looking up from his phone. "I'm aware I'm in the car." Her jaw tightened. "I wasn't staring." "You were." He ended his call and slid the phone into his breast pocket. Then for the first time since the chapel, he actually looked at her. Not warmly, not cruelly, just appraisingly, the way a man looks at something he's just acquired and is deciding where to put it. "I want to be clear about how this works." "You already were," she said, "at the altar." "I want to be clearer." He adjusted his cufflink. "You'll live in my building. You'll attend functions when I require it. You'll behave appropriately in public, and you won't ask questions about my business. In return, your family's debt disappears. All of it. Every account, every lien, every back payment your father buried before he died. Gone." Alaina felt the words like a hand pressing down on her chest. "I know the terms, Mr. Voss." "Adrian. What? My name. In public you will use it. In private you can call me whatever you want." He paused. "Within reason." She didn't respond. He turned back to the window. "There's a room prepared for you on the east side of the penthouse. Staff will show you in. You won't be disturbed." "And what do you get?" She asked before she could stop herself. He glanced over at her again, this time with something almost like curiosity. "What? You wiped out a dead man's debt and married a woman you don't know? So what do you actually get out of this?" She kept her voice steady even though her hands were balled in her lap. "Because men like you don't do anything without a reason." The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Your father's company holds a government contract," he finally said. "With you as his heir and as my wife, that contract becomes accessible to me. Legally." He said the last word with a faint, deliberate weight, like he found it mildly amusing. "It's cleaner than the alternative." She didn't ask what the alternative was. She didn't want to know. The car pulled up to a glass tower in the center of the financial district, and a doorman was already waiting with an umbrella before the vehicle had fully stopped. Alaina reached for the door handle, but Adrian spoke again. "One more thing." She stopped. "Don't try to leave," he said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was something worse, a statement of fact delivered with the same casual certainty as everything else he said. "Not because I'll stop you, but because you have nowhere to go that I can't find you, and we both know it. So make it easier on yourself." She got out of the car without responding. The doorman walked her inside. Adrian did not follow immediately. She could feel him still watching from the car, and she hated how much that awareness sat on her skin like a temperature change, something her body registered before her mind gave it permission. The penthouse was obscene. Not in a gaudy way, there were no gold fixtures or crystal chandeliers or the kind of excess that screamed insecurity. It was worse than that. It was tasteful. Perfectly coldly tasteful, like a spread from an architecture magazine for people who had run out of things to want. Floor-to-ceiling windows, pale stone floors, furniture that looked expensive precisely because it looked like it had never been touched. A woman named Vera met her at the elevator, mid-50s, efficient, not unkind. She showed Alaina the East Wing bedroom, the closet that had been stocked with clothes in her size, the bathroom, the schedule for meals. "There's a schedule for meals?" Alaina asked. "Mr. Voss keeps a structured household," Vera said without apology. "And if I'm not hungry at 7, then you let me know by 6:30. Vera set a small card on the nightstand. "This is my extension. Anything you need, day or night." She paused at the door. "The West Wing is Mr. Voss's. You won't be expected there." And then she was gone. Alaina sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress and looked around the room that was supposed to be her life now. The sheets were white. The walls were white. The silence was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She thought about her mother who had cried when Alaina told her. Not from grief, from relief. 22 years of her father's bad decisions, and this was the thing that finally cleared the ledger. Alaina had watched her mother's face and understood, in a way she hadn't fully before, that relief and guilt could look almost identical from the outside. She unclipped her mother's earrings and set them on the nightstand beside Vera's card. She did not cry. She had made a choice, and she was going to live in it with both eyes open. The first week passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Adrian Voss was present in the way that a weather system is present. You knew it was there. You felt the pressure of it, but it rarely touched you directly. He left early. He returned late. Sometimes he didn't return at all, and Vera would simply move through the penthouse with the same unruffled efficiency, and Alaina understood not to ask. She established a routine, because routine was the only architecture she knew how to build in an unfamiliar place. She woke at 6. She ran on the treadmill in the gym on the lower floor. She ate at 7, usually alone, reading anything she could find in the penthouse's surprisingly well-stocked library. She responded to the emails her mother sent, careful edited emails that said everything was fine, that she was adjusting, that he was courteous. All of which was technically true. On the 5th night, she made the mistake of wandering into the main kitchen at 11 o'clock because she couldn't sleep and she wanted tea. She hadn't expected Adrian to be there. He was standing at the counter in a dress shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows and his jacket thrown over a stool, reading something on his phone. There was a glass of something amber beside him. He looked up when she walked in, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Tea," she said, because she needed to say something. "Cabinet above the stove," he replied, and looked back at his phone. She moved to the stove, found the cabinet, found the tea, filled the kettle and set it on the burner, and stood there waiting for the water to heat, hyper-aware of the 12 feet of kitchen island between them. "You run every morning," he said without looking up. She blinked. "You've noticed. Building security logs movement. Comforting." He set his phone down then. He picked up his glass, and he looked at her in a way that wasn't quite calculating and wasn't quite curious, and she couldn't decide which it was. "You're not what I expected." She turned to face him. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened." The kettle began to hiss. She held his gaze. "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not going to perform it for you." Something moved across his face, barely the way a shadow moves when a cloud passes so quickly you're not sure you really saw it. He picked up his phone again. "The tea's ready," he said. She made her tea. She went back to her room. She lay awake for another 2 hours thinking about the way he had looked at her and hating herself for thinking about it at all. It was the housekeeper's day off when Alaina found the door. She hadn't been snooping. She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself. She had been looking for a specific edition of a Steinbeck novel she'd spotted from across the room and tracked to a shelf in what she thought was the main study, which turned out to be an anteroom, which turned out to connect to a secondary office that was not the one Adrian used for his phone calls. The door was heavy, metal reinforced, she thought, behind the wood veneer. It was locked. But what stopped her wasn't the lock, it was the sound she heard when she stood close enough. Voices, low, tense, in a language she didn't recognize at first, and then did not, from fluency, but from a specific quality in the vowels, a cadence she'd heard once in a documentary about Eastern European organized crime syndicates. She stepped back from the door. Her heart was knocking against her ribs. She turned around and walked directly to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the sink until her hands stopped shaking. She had known what she was walking into. She had told herself that over and over on the night her mother had laid out the terms. She had told herself she understood what Adrian Voss was, what the word business meant when it came out of his mouth in that flat, dispassionate register. She had understood it the way you understand a statistic as a fact without texture. Standing outside that door, she understood it differently. She drank her water. She set the glass in the sink. She went back to the library and found a different Steinbeck. She did not mention the door. Not that night, not the next day, but she didn't forget it either. 10 days into her new life, Adrian appeared at the breakfast table. She almost knocked her coffee over. He sat across from her like he had always sat there, like it was completely unremarkable, and he accepted a cup from Vera and opened his phone and began reading whatever it was he read at 7 in the morning. Alaina reset her grip on her mug and said nothing. 3 minutes passed. "You went into the East Study yesterday," he said. She felt her pulse spike and forced her expression flat. "I was looking for a book." "I know." He scrolled something on his phone. "There's no issue. I'm letting you know the room beyond it is off limits. Not because I think you'd do anything, because the people I meet with don't like surprises." "Understood," she said. "Good." Another silence. She picked up her fork. "The contract review is Thursday," he said. "There's a dinner with the city planning board beforehand. You'll need to be there." She set her fork back down. "As your wife." "As my wife," he confirmed. "Cocktails at 7. I'll have something sent over from the stylist. I'm capable of dressing myself." He glanced up at that. "I know you are. The stylist is for the optics. Those men will spend the first 10 minutes of the evening forming a judgment about me based on you, and I'd prefer the judgment to be exactly the one I want." It was such a blunt, transactional thing to say that she almost laughed, not from amusement, but from a kind of grim recognition. At least he didn't pretend. She could give him that. He never, not once, pretended that this was something it wasn't. "What judgment do you want?" she asked. He considered the question for a moment, which surprised her. He could have deflected. He didn't. "That I'm settled," he said finally. "Stable, not just powerful, rooted. Men with roots are harder to move against than men who are only powerful." She thought about that. "So I'm an anchor. Or a cornerstone," he said, "depending on how you look at it." He went back to his phone. She went back to her breakfast. And she sat with the strange, quiet discomfort of realizing that being called a cornerstone by Adrian Voss was somehow more unsettling than being called an acquisition. The dinner on Thursday was its own kind of theater. She wore a deep navy dress that the stylist selected and she privately admitted was perfect. She let the woman handle her hair and her shoes and the single strand of diamonds that Adrian had left on the vanity that morning without a note. She put them on and she looked at herself in the mirror and she thought, "You are performing." And then she thought, so is he. So is everyone in that room going to be. At least she knew the play. The car ride over, Adrian looked at her once and said, "You look appropriate." "High praise," she said. "It was meant as one," he said. She looked at him sharply. His expression was unreadable, but he wasn't looking at his phone, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of statement. The gala was loud and gilded and full of men who shook Adrian's hand with both of theirs and laughed too hard at things he said. Alaina stayed close the way she'd agreed to, and she smiled when she was supposed to smile and deflected the probing questions from council members' wives with the graceful opacity of someone who had grown up watching her father manage public appearances while private things burned behind closed doors. She was good at this. She hated that she was good at this. It was near the end of the cocktail hour that she noticed the man across the room. He wasn't part of the city planning crowd. She could tell because he wasn't working the room, he was watching it. Specifically, he was watching Adrian with the still, patient attention of someone who was not there to socialize. She leaned slightly closer to Adrian. "Don't react," she said quietly, the way people speak in crowded rooms and when they need to say something that can't be seen. "Man by the East Bar, dark jacket. He's been looking at you for 6 minutes." Adrian didn't turn. He continued his conversation with the deputy commissioner beside him. But his hand, which had been in his jacket pocket, moved to the small of her back, a light touch barely there. She felt it like a contact burn. "I see him," he murmured just at her ear. "He's not security," she said. "He's holding his glass, but not drinking. and he came in after the party was already established. Adrian said something to the deputy commissioner about scheduling a follow-up, and then he turned his body in a way that looked like he was simply redirecting his attention to Alaina, the way husbands do at parties. To anyone watching, it looked domestic, affectionate even. He touched her jaw, lightly tilting her face just a degree, like he was about to say something intimate. "How do you know what security looks like?" he said. "My father had problems," she said. "I learned to read rooms." His hand was still at her jaw. She was very carefully not reacting to it. "The man's name is Gregor Talev," he said so quietly she felt more than heard it. "He's not here for you. Stay close. Don't look at him again." "Are we in danger?" "Not yet." "That's not as comforting as you think it is." His mouth curved just barely, just for a second, something almost like a smile gone, before she could be certain it was there. "I know," he said. And then he lowered his hand and turned back to the room and became Adrian Voss, Mafia cornerstone again, smooth and unruffled and in absolute control. Alaina straightened. She accepted a fresh glass of wine from a passing server. She did not look at the East Bar, but her heart was beating very fast. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the hypervigilance that had kicked in the way it always had in her father's house, when things were about to go sideways beneath all of that running, like a current she couldn't quite name, was the stunned, inconvenient realization that he had listened to her, not dismissed her, not looked at her like she was overreacting, not brushed past her observation with the kind of condescension she'd braced for. He had said, "I see him." He had said, "Stay close." And she had the terrible, disorienting feeling that in that moment, those two words, "stay close," had meant something to her that she wasn't prepared to look at directly. Not yet. The car ride home was silent, but it was a different silence than the one from their wedding night. That one had been a wall. This one was, she didn't have a word for it, something pressurized, something that was waiting. "You did well," he said, when they were almost home. She looked at her hands in her lap. "You sound surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm acknowledging it." She didn't respond. "The man Talev," he said after a moment. "He won't be a problem. I've already handled it." "How?" He looked at her. "You don't want the answer to that." She held his gaze. "No," she agreed. "I don't." The car stopped. The doorman appeared. The city went on behind them, indifferent and loud and alive. Alaina stepped out into the night air and felt with absolute clarity that something had shifted, something she hadn't agreed to and hadn't chosen and wouldn't be able to undo by simply deciding not to think about it. She was not just a signature on a document anymore. She didn't know what she was, but it was something else. And Adrian Voss, standing 3 feet behind her, looking up at the building that was both of their homes in the most hollow sense of the word, he felt it too. She could tell without seeing his face, without him saying a word. She could just tell. She walked inside. He followed, and neither of them slept particularly well that night. She hadn't meant to think about him when she woke up. That was the part that bothered her most. Not the marriage, not the penthouse, not the locked door with the voices behind it, or the man named Gregor Talev who had watched Adrian from across a gala room with the patience of someone who had been paid to wait. Those things she could file away, categorize, hold at a distance with the same careful emotional architecture she'd been building since she was 14 years old, and realized her father's business troubles were never going to stop being her problem. What she hadn't accounted for was waking up at 5 in the morning with the specific, infuriating memory of Adrian's hand at the small of her back, barely touching, barely there, and feeling it like a brand. She got up. She put on her running shoes. She went to the gym. She ran 4 miles harder than she needed to, and when she was done, she stood over the sink and told her reflection to get it together. Her reflection did not look convinced. Vera had coffee waiting when she came upstairs, which meant Vera had been watching the gym camera feed, which meant Alaina had absolutely zero privacy in this building and had somehow forgotten that fact for approximately 6 hours. She accepted the coffee with a tight smile and sat at the kitchen island and tried to read. She was on the same paragraph for the 3rd time when Adrian walked in. He was already dressed, suit tie, the whole architecture of control assembled before 7 in the morning, like some kind of personal policy. He went to the coffee maker without acknowledging her, which was standard, and then he turned around and leaned against the counter and said, "I need to discuss something with you." She set her book down. Good morning to you too. Good morning. He said it like a concession. I need to discuss something with you. You said that. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense again, the one she kept having and kept trying to dismiss, that he was recalibrating something, adjusting to her in a way he hadn't expected to have to. There's a situation developing, he said. Nothing that affects you directly, but it will require me to be less available for the next several days, and it may require some changes to the household routine. What kind of changes? Additional security personnel in the building. A car assigned to you anytime you leave. He paused. I'd prefer you didn't leave. She put her coffee down. Adrian, it's temporary. You're telling me I can't go outside. I'm telling you that I'd prefer you didn't, which is different. He held her gaze. I can't make you do anything. You've made that clear. I'm asking. That stopped her. Because he was right, he was asking, and it was the first time since their wedding night that he had phrased anything as a request, rather than a structure she was expected to operate within. She wasn't sure what to do with that. How many days, she said. 3, maybe 4, and after that it goes back to normal. Something flickered in his face. Something like that, he said. She didn't love the qualifier, but she nodded. He turned back to his coffee and she thought the conversation was over, and then he said without turning around, You were right about Talev. She went still. Last night, what you noticed. He picked up his cup. It mattered, I want you to know that. And then he walked out of the kitchen, and Alaina sat with her cold coffee and her unread book and the strange hollow ache of being thanked by a man who had never intended to need her for anything at all. She picked up her book. She turned the page. She did not retain a single word. By noon, there were 3 men in the lobby she hadn't seen before. Vera introduced them as building staff, which was the polite fiction everyone was apparently agreeing to maintain. They wore suits instead of uniforms, and they stood near the elevator bank with the specific weight-distributed stillness of people who had been trained to look casual while being anything but. Alaina walked past them to get her mail and felt their eyes track her like a system update. She went back upstairs and called her mother. You sound tired, her mother said in lieu of hello. I'm fine, Mom. You always say that when you're not, and sometimes I say it when I am. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. How are you? Is the apartment all right? It's wonderful, Alaina. It's more space than I know what to do with. A pause. He really just paid it all of it. That was the arrangement. I know what the arrangement was. Her mother's voice went soft in a way that always meant she was choosing words carefully. I want to know if you're all right, not your living situation, you. Alaina looked at the window, at the city laid out behind it, indifferent and vast. I'm figuring it out, she said. It's not what I expected. Is he, Her mother stopped, tried again. Is he unkind? She thought about the chapel, about the man on the floor with cracked ribs, about Adrian's knuckles and what they'd looked like when he'd straightened his tie and walked to the altar like nothing had happened at all. No, she said honestly, he's not unkind. That's not the same as being good. No, she agreed, it's not. There was a long silence, then her mother said, Be careful, sweetheart. Not of him necessarily. Be careful of yourself, of what you let yourself. She seemed to run out of words. I know, Alaina said. I know, Mom. She hung up and sat in the quiet for a long time. She was still sitting there when she heard a sharp raised voice from somewhere in the penthouse. Not Vera, not one of the lobby security men. A voice she hadn't heard before, and it was angry in the way that people get when they have been holding something in, and the container finally cracks. She moved to her door and opened it a few inches. The voice was coming from Adrian's office. The door was ajar, which was itself unusual enough to prickle the back of her neck, and she could hear 2 distinct voices. Now Adrian's low and controlled, the other man's escalating in a way that had a specific quality to it. The quality of someone who was frightened underneath the anger. You told us it was handled, the other man said. Talev was supposed to be. He was managed, Adrian said. The situation changed. Changed. People are dead, Adrian. Our people. A silence that lasted long enough to feel like something being swallowed. I know, Adrian said. Mira's asking questions. If she thinks we had anything to do with the Talev meeting and didn't tell her, she's not going to think that because you're not going to tell her. Adrian's voice had dropped another register, which Alaina was learning was a specific kind of warning, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, like pressure applied to something structural. I need 2 days. That's all. Keep Mira where she is and give me 2 days. And if she won't stay, then that becomes a different problem. Adrian said, and you know how I handle different problems. A long, unsteady exhale from the other man. Then footsteps. Alaina pulled her door shut silently and stood with her back against it, breathing through her nose, counting to 10 the way her father's old business manager had taught her to do when she was 16, and her father came home in one of his states. It still worked. It still made her feel vaguely like a child. She thought about what she just heard. People were dead. Someone named Mira was asking questions. And Adrian, who had told her that the situation with Taleb was handled, who had told her that nothing affected her directly, Adrian was in his office trying to hold something together with 2 days and pure force of will. The apartment door opened and shut. The other man was gone. She counted to 60 before she moved. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, and she was standing at the sink when Adrian's office door opened fully, and he came out and stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the length of the open floor plan. I heard voices, she said, which was true without being the whole truth. He studied her face. How much did you hear? Enough to know your 2-day timeline is optimistic. His jaw tightened, just barely, just for a second. Then he came to the kitchen and poured his own glass of water and stood beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was different, and drank half of it before he said anything. What do you know about the name Mira Venn? She blinked. Should I know it? Your father did business with her husband 8 years ago. Import licensing. He set his glass down. Her husband is dead now. She runs his operation. And Taleb worked for her. He looked at her. Yes. So last night wasn't a coincidence. She turned to face him fully. She sent him. She sent him to observe, he said carefully, to confirm a timeline she'd been given about this contract. Someone told her things they shouldn't have known, and she sent Taleb to verify. What things? He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man deciding how much of a door to open. That I married you to get access to your father's contract, which is true, and that the contract itself contains a provision that once activated would allow me to move assets through a government-protected channel that Mira has been trying to access for 3 years. Alaina processed that. So she doesn't want to stop the contract, she wants to use it. She wants to use me, he said, or replace me, whichever is faster. And she's dangerous. He didn't hesitate. Extremely. She set her own glass down and crossed her arms. Not defensively, just to give her hands something to do to keep the visible parts of herself organized while she thought. You said this doesn't affect me directly. It doesn't. Adrian, she sent someone to a gala we were both at. To watch me. I was standing next to you and he held her gaze, and for a moment, something moved behind his eyes that she hadn't seen there before. Not calculation, not the cool, efficient management of a situation. Something more uncomfortable than that. Something that looked almost like concern. I'm aware of that, he said quietly. The honesty of it knocked her slightly off balance. She'd expected deflection, management, the Vera-style smooth efficiency of someone who was practiced at keeping inconvenient realities at a comfortable distance. Okay, she said. Okay, otustim. You told me the truth, that's... She paused, sorting through what she actually wanted to say. That's more than I expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're better at this than you should be. At what? At not falling apart. She felt something tighten in her chest. I had a lot of practice, she said. My father saw to that. He nodded just once, and she had the sense that he understood more about that statement than she'd offered, and wasn't going to push into the space she hadn't opened, which was somehow more respectful than sympathy would have been. The additional security, he said, shifting registers back to the practical. It's not just protocol. I need you to take it seriously. I am taking it seriously. I need you to stay in the building tonight, specifically. Why tonight? He picked up his glass again, not to drink from it, but to have something to hold. She was starting to recognize the tells, the small, physical anchors he reached for when he was managing more than he was showing. Because I have a meeting tonight that may not go well, he said. And if it doesn't, I want to know where you are. She stared at him. You want to know where I am? Yes, because you're worried. He set the glass, because it's strategically simpler to have one known variable in an unpredictable evening. She almost smiled, not from happiness, from recognition. The way he reached for logic as insulation over feeling, the way the coldest framing was always the one he led with. She recognized it because she did it too, just differently. All right, she said. I'll stay in. She turned to go. Alaina. She stopped. He almost never used her name. The fact that he did now made her turn back around. He was looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a word for, the one that wasn't quite calculating and wasn't quite open, that sat in the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two. The earrings last night, he said, your mother's. She waited. You wore them under the ones the stylist sent. And she hadn't realized he'd noticed. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed she'd kept the pearls at her collar mostly hidden. Yes, she said. Why? She thought about lying. She thought about deflecting. She did neither. Because I needed something of mine in a room full of things that weren't, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. That's fair, he said finally, and then lower almost to himself. That's very fair. She left the kitchen. She went back to her room. She sat on the bed and pressed her hands to her face and breathed slowly in and out until the feeling in her chest settled into something she could manage. She didn't have a name for any of this. She wasn't sure she wanted one yet. But she was beginning to understand that the man she had married, the man who had cracked someone's ribs in a chapel and then straightened his tie without blinking, was not one thing. He was not simply the cold, dispassionate construction she'd been preparing to endure. He was layered in a way that was going to make endurance considerably more complicated. And complicated, in Alaina Cross's experience, was always where things started to hurt. She changed out of her running clothes. She found the Steinbeck. She actually read it this time. At 6:15, Vera knocked and told her dinner would be in 30 minutes. At 6:43, black cars left the underground garage in formation. Alaina stood at the window and watched the taillights disappear into traffic, and she did not let herself think about what kind of meeting required 3 cars and no advance notice. She ate dinner alone. She read for another hour. She watched the city go dark. At 11:13, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text. From a number she didn't have saved, but the message was 3 words and she knew immediately who had sent it. Meeting went long. She stared at the screen. Her thumbs moved before she'd made a conscious decision. Are you all right? The response came in 40 seconds. Functional. Go to sleep. She almost laughed. She almost actually laughed, the sharp, surprised kind that came out before you could choose whether to let it. She set the phone down on her chest and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word functional, how it was the most Adrian Voss way possible to answer the question. Are you all right? How it communicated everything and nothing at once. She thought he texted me. He didn't have to text her. He didn't owe her an update. She was a variable, a contract signatory, a cornerstone, his word, in a business arrangement that had nothing to do with 1113 texts from block numbers after meetings that went long. He had texted her anyway. She put the phone on the nightstand. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around her. The low hum of the elevator, the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below, the particular silence of a space that had been designed for one person and was now holding 2. She didn't sleep for a long time, but just before she did, she heard the elevator open, heard footsteps, his footsteps. She knew them now, heavier on the left than the right, something she'd noticed without meaning to. They passed her door and continued to the west wing and stopped. A door opened, a door closed, and the penthouse settled back into quiet. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she told herself, everything would look different, more manageable, more distance. She would recalibrate the way she always did, and she would return to the clean, simple operating principle she'd set for herself on the night she'd signed that paper in an empty chapel in her mother's earrings. Survive this, nothing more. She repeated it until it felt true. By morning, she wasn't sure it was anymore. She told herself the text meant nothing. She told herself that 3 times before breakfast and twice more during her run, and by the time she was back upstairs with wet hair and a cup of coffee she didn't taste, she had almost convinced herself it was true. Almost. Adrian was not at the breakfast table. His door was shut. Vera moved through the kitchen with her usual measured efficiency and said nothing about the 3 black cars that had come back at midnight or the fact that two of Adrian's security team had spent the night in the lobby instead of going home. Alaina didn't ask. She had learned in the 2 weeks since her wedding that the penthouse ran on a system of careful silences, and that pushing into those silences before she understood their shape was the fastest way to lose ground she hadn't even known she was standing on. She read, she answered emails. She called the attorney handling her father's estate, the last remaining thread of administrative grief. She was still pulling through and listened to him explain for the third time what finalizing the transfer of the government contract to Adrian's holding company required one more signature on one more form she hadn't known existed. Can you email it? She asked. Mrs. Voss, this particular document requires notarization and a witness from. Then send it and I'll arrange the rest, she said. Thank you. She hung up and sat with the title for a moment. Mrs. Voss, she still flinched every time. Not from shame or anger, just from the strangeness of it, the way a new shoe fits wrong before it fits right, except she wasn't sure this one was ever going to fit at all. At 10:15, Adrian's door opened. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was notable because he looked like every other version of himself, controlled, assembled, not a crease out of place, except for something around the eyes, a tightness, a weight that wasn't there the morning before. He went to the coffee maker and she watched him pour a cup and drink half of it, standing at the counter with his back to her, and she made the decision consciously and deliberately not to ask how the meeting went. She picked up her book. The meeting, he said, didn't go well. She looked up. He was still facing the counter. His shoulders were set in a way that communicated something she didn't have language for, not defeat exactly, but the particular tension of a man who has spent the night holding a structure together and is not yet certain it will hold. Miraven sent a representative, he said, not Talev, someone else, someone with more authority and fewer manners. He turned around. She's accelerating her timeline, which means the 2 days I asked for are now 24 hours. He set his cup down, which means I need to move some things faster than I planned. Alaina set her book on the table entirely. What things? He looked at her for a moment, that recalibrating look, the one she kept catching him doing when he thought she wasn't watching closely enough. The contract, he said, the notarization, your attorney mentioned the final signature. She went still. You spoke to my attorney. He called this office number. Vera took the message. I just spoke to him 20 minutes ago. I know. He sat down across from her, which he had never done before. Always the island, always the distance of the counter between them. And now he was at the same table 3 feet away, and it rearranged the air in a way she felt before she processed. I need that document signed and filed by end of business today, he said. Not because I'm pressuring you, because if Mira gets access to it before it's formally transferred, she has grounds to contest the whole arrangement, including the debt clearance. The last 2 words landed with the weight he intended, including the debt clearance, including the thing that had bought her mother a clean apartment and 4 nights of actual sleep for the first time in years, including the only reason Alaina was sitting in this penthouse at all. She can undo it, Alaina asked. She can try, he said. I'd rather not give her the opportunity. Alaina held his gaze. 30 seconds, long enough to decide. Send the notary here, she said. I'll have it done by noon. Something in Adrian's posture shifted barely just a degree, the way a building settles when a load is properly distributed. Thank you, he said. She almost said you're welcome and caught herself. This was still a transaction. She needed to remember that. Don't thank me, she said. It protects my mother too. He nodded. He understood the distinction. That was the thing about Adrian Voss. He always understood the distinctions. He just didn't always acknowledge them. And on the rare occasions that he did, it landed with a precision that was more disarming than any warmth she'd encountered in her entire life. He stood. He picked up his coffee. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen. Alaina. Yes. The man Mira sent last night. He paused. He knew your name. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 2 degrees. What? He used it specifically. Said he hoped Mrs. Voss was comfortable in her new home. Adrian's jaw was tight. It was a message. Not a threat, not yet. But I want you to understand that she knows you exist. She knows what you represent to this arrangement. And she is not above using that. Alaina said nothing for a moment. The part of her that was practical and cold and had survived her father's chaos for 20 years cataloged the information and filed it. The part of her that was still human, that still had a pulse, felt it race. "Am I in danger?" she asked. Straight, no tremor. He looked at her directly. "Not if I can help it." "That's the second time you've said something like that," she said, "and it's still not a no." His mouth pressed together, not quite a line, not quite anything she could read. "No," he said, "you're not in danger. I won't let that happen." He left. She sat at the table and breathed through the fear until it became something manageable. And then she picked up her phone and called her mother's number and listened to it ring 4 times before sending it to voicemail. She left a message that said everything was fine, and she'd call later, and she loved her, and she said all 3 of those things in a completely steady voice, which was its own kind of victory. The notary arrived at 11:40. The document was signed and witnessed and filed electronically at 12:08. Alaina texted Adrian the confirmation number, 4 digits and a timestamp, and he responded in under 30 seconds with a single word: "Good." She set the phone face down and went to find something for lunch. It was Vera who told her about the gala. Not directly, Vera didn't do anything. Directly, she communicated in the careful, lateral language of a woman who had worked for powerful men long enough to know that information delivered sideways landed softer than information delivered straight on. She mentioned while setting out a plate that the dry cleaning for Adrian's tuxedo had been returned. She mentioned while straightening the napkin that the event at the Harrington Hotel on Friday was black tie. She mentioned while turning to go that the stylist had called to confirm Alaina's appointment for Thursday afternoon. Alaina looked up. "There's another event." Vera paused at the door. "Friday evening, yes." Adrian didn't mention it. "He may have had other things on his mind," Vera said, which was the diplomatic equivalent of "the man is currently holding an active crisis together with cufflinks and willpower, so perhaps extend some grace. The appointment Thursday is at 2. She left. Alaina ate her lunch and thought about the Harrington Gala and thought about Mira Van, who knew her name and had sent a message in the form of using it, and thought about what it meant to walk into a room like that on Adrian's arm, when somewhere in that room or connected to it or watching it, there was a woman who considered her a variable in a conflict that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her at exactly the same time. She thought I should be terrified. She thought I'm angry instead. That felt more useful. Adrian came back at 4, which was early for him, which meant something was either resolved or escalating. Alaina was in the library when she heard the elevator. She heard him stop in the kitchen, heard the low murmur of him and Vera exchanging information, heard Vera's measured responses. Then silence. Then footsteps toward the library. He knocked on the open door, which was new. "Come in," she said, which was absurd since it was his penthouse, but neither of them addressed that. He stood in the doorway. He looked less assembled than the morning his tie loosened jacket off the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the forearm. She had noticed in the past 2 weeks that the tattoos extended from his neck, down his arms and across his hands, more complex and more extensive than she'd initially registered. Right now, they were fully visible. She did not let herself study them. "The Gala Friday," he said. "Vera told me." "I should have told you myself." He said it plainly, without overqualifying it. "The timing wasn't 'I should have told you.'" "It's fine," she said. "It's not actually." He came into the room properly now, which was unusual enough to make her sit up slightly. He sat in the chair across from the sofa, and they were in the same configuration as the breakfast table that morning, but with books on all sides and the ambient quality of the library making it feel absurdly like something almost close to normal. "The Harrington event matters," he said, "more than the planning board dinner. There will be people there who are specifically watching how things stand between us." She understood the implication. People connected to Mira. Some of them, yes, and others who are watching to see which way this contract situation resolves. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I need Friday to look like a marriage that's working." "We've done that once already," she said. "This is different. These people are sharper. They'll be looking for seams." He held her gaze. "I need it to look real." The words sat between them for a moment. "What does real look like?" she asked. "Comfortable," he said. "Like we know each other." He paused. "Like you trust me." She almost said something sharp about the inherent irony of a man asking her to perform trust, but she swallowed it. Not because it wasn't true, because it wasn't productive, and she was her father's daughter enough to know the difference. "You're going to have to give me something to work with," she said instead. If you want this to look like a real marriage, you can't operate like I'm the night cleaning staff who happens to live in the building." He looked at her for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean, talk to me," she said. "Not about contracts, not about security protocols. Talk to me like I'm a person you chose." She held his gaze. "I don't need the full truth. I just need enough to build something on." He was quiet, the library kind of quiet, which was deep and soft-edged and made everything feel slightly more honest than it was prepared to be. "My father was not unlike yours," he said finally. She didn't move. "Different mechanics," he continued. "Same architecture. The kind of man who built everything on borrowed leverage and taught his son that the only safe relationship was a transactional one." He looked at his hands, at the tattoos, the knuckles, the evidence of a life that had been a specific kind of hard. "I've been operating on that principle for 20 years. It works. It's never not worked." He paused. "You are the first person in a very long time who has made me wonder whether it's the only principle available." Alaina said nothing. Because the thing about a confession like that, real unpolished, offered without strategy, was that the right response was silence. You didn't fill it. You let it exist. He looked up at her. "That's what I can give you," he said. "That's enough," she said, and meant it. They sat with the quiet for another few seconds. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket and the moment broke. The way all honest moments broke, interrupted by the world outside them, which never particularly cared about timing. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed. "I need to make a call." "Go," she said. He was at the door before she thought to ask, and she didn't know what made her say it, instinct, or the residue of the conversation, or simply the fact that she was tired of carefully not asking things. "Adrian, the gala Friday, is Miraven going to be there?" He stopped. His back was to her. A full 3 seconds passed. "Yes," he said. "Will she approach us?" "Possibly." "Then I need to know what she wants," Alaina said. "Not the version you have decided I should know. What she actually wants and what she's actually willing to do to get it. Because if I'm standing next to you in that room and she says something, I need to be ready, and I can't be ready if I'm working with half the information." He turned around and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't calculation. It wasn't the cool appraisal she'd cataloged a dozen times. It was something more exposed than that, something that looked like the beginning of respect, the kind that arrives not because you've earned it incrementally, but because you've said the exact right thing at the exact right moment, and the other person recognizes it bone deep. "All right," he said. "All right, tonight," he said. "After dinner. I'll tell you what you need to know." He left. She heard his office door close. She sat in the library with her heart beating slightly too fast, and told herself it was because of Miraven and the gala and the very reasonable fear of walking into a room where someone considered her a strategic target. She told herself it had nothing to do with what he'd said about his father and the principal in the first person in a very long time. She told herself that right up until dinner, which Vera served at 7, and at which Adrian sat across from her, not at the island, at the actual table, and passed her the bread without being asked because he'd watched her reach for it 3 mornings in a row and remembered. Small, stupid, meaningless. She felt it anyway. After dinner, he sat across from her in the living room, and he told her about Miraven. Not everything she understood there were layers he would always hold back, and she wasn't asking for those. But he told her about the offshore channel the government contract protected, about Mira's husband and what he'd built and what Mira had inherited and improved and sharpened into something considerably more dangerous than her husband had ever managed. He told her that Mira's approach was always lateral. She never came at a target directly. She came at the things around the target. She applied pressure to soft points until the structure gave way on its own. "Like a marriage," Alaina said. "Like a wife," he said, specifically. She absorbed that. "She's going to try to get to you through me. She's going to try to make you a liability," he said, "either by frightening you into making a mistake or by making me frightened for you, which would be..." He stopped. She waited. "Which would be what?" He looked at her steadily. "More effective," he said, "than it should be." The living room was very quiet. The city was 40 floors below them, unreachable and irrelevant. Alaina looked at the man across from her. This man she had married in an empty chapel, who had cracked someone's ribs and straightened his tie and texted her the word functional at 11:13 at night, who had just told her in the most controlled and oblique way imaginable that he was afraid of losing her, and she felt something in her chest give way. Not collapse, not break, just give. The way a door gives when someone finally pushes in the right direction. Then we don't give her the opening, she said. He nodded slowly. I'll be ready Friday, she said. Tell me what to watch for. And he did. They sat there until almost midnight, not close, not touching the careful architecture of their boundaries, still intact, and he talked to her like she was a partner. Like her read on a room mattered. Like the things she'd said in the library about needing enough to build on was not a complaint but a blueprint, and he was finally willing to use it. When she finally went to her room, she stood at the window for a long time and looked at the city and thought about what he'd said. More effective than it should be. She knew what that meant. She knew exactly what that meant. And the terrifying thing, the thing that would keep her awake for the second night running, was that she felt it too. Equally, identically, and equally without a safe place to put it. The bullet had grazed his left side. That was what they told her. Grazed, like the word was supposed to make it smaller than it was, like the fact that it wasn't 6 inches to the right was supposed to be the part she focused on. She sat in the chair beside the bed in the private medical suite on the 42nd floor, a room she hadn't known existed until 40 minutes ago. A doctor she hadn't known was on retainer until he was already there with his kit open, and she watched Adrian breathe and told herself to stop shaking. She stopped shaking. It took effort, but she stopped. The Harrington Gala had ended in 11 seconds of gunfire and 20 minutes of controlled chaos that Adrian had somehow managed like a man who had rehearsed for it, which she was beginning to understand he probably had. He had put her behind him before she'd even processed the first shot. His hand had found her wrist in the dark, and he had moved her, not dragged, not panicked, moved her with the specific deliberate force of someone who had already calculated the geometry of the room and knew exactly where the safe angle was. She had felt the moment he was hit, not from sound, from the way his grip on her wrist changed a microsecond of pressure, a sharp, involuntary tightening, and then he had smoothed it out so fast she almost doubted what she'd felt. He hadn't told her he was hit, not in the car, not in the elevator. He had kept talking low-focused, giving instructions to the two men flanking them. And it wasn't until they were inside and Vera had seen his shirt and gone white under her composure that Alaina had understood what that grip had meant. You didn't tell me, she said now. Her voice was even. She had decided it was going to be even. Adrian was sitting up against the headboard, the doctor's work already done, a bandage beneath the shirt they'd cut away. He looked annoyed, which she took as a sign he was not actually dying. There was nothing useful you could have done with the information in the car, he said. That's not the point. It is, actually. No. She leaned forward. The point is that you were hit, and you held my wrist, and you kept talking to me like nothing had happened, and I felt it, Adrian. I felt the moment it happened, and you covered it over and kept moving, and I need you to understand that is not acceptable to me. He looked at her. The annoyance shifted into something else, something more careful. I needed you calm, he said. I was calm. You were calm because you didn't know. I would have been calm anyway, she said. You should have known that by now. The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant he was absorbing something he hadn't expected, rearranging it against what he thought he knew, checking it for structural integrity. She recognized it because she'd been watching him think for 3 weeks, and she knew the texture of his silences, now the way you know the sounds a house makes when you've lived in it long enough. You're right, he said finally. 2 words. Flat and unqualified and real. She sat back. I know. He almost smiled. She saw it, the almost of it, the way his mouth moved a fraction before he pulled it back. She was getting faster at catching those. The shooter was one of Mira's contractors, he said, shifting back to the information layer where he was more comfortable. Not a direct employee, deniable. Was it meant to kill you? No. He said it with certainty. If it was meant to kill me, I'd be dead. It was a message, same as Talev, same as the gala itself. He paused. She's escalating. Then she's getting desperate. He looked at her sharply. Why do you say that? Because everything she's done has been lateral, Alaina said. You told me that yourself. She doesn't come at a target directly, but this was direct. Gunfire at a public event with witnesses and cameras. She held his gaze. That's not strategy. That's pressure. And pressure means something isn't working the way she planned. 3 seconds of silence. The contract, he said slowly, Filed at 12:08, she said. Confirmed. The window she needed closed the same afternoon she sent her man to your meeting. She watched it land on him, watched him work through the timeline, the sequence, the implication. She lost the legal route the moment that document was processed. Everything since has been her trying to recover ground she's already lost. Adrian looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Completely unguarded, not calculated, not assembled, not managed. Just open, in the way a person looks when they have been surprised by something and haven't had time to decide how to feel about it yet. You worked that out, he said. I had time to think in the chair, she said. You were unconscious for 20 minutes. I was not unconscious. You had your eyes closed. I was resting. Adrian, she said it quietly, firmly. You scared me. He went still. Every managed layer of him went still, and what was left underneath was something raw and undefended that he clearly hadn't intended to show. And she watched him process the choice whether to cover it back over with efficiency and structure and the clean transactional language of a man who had decided a long time ago that feeling things was a tactical liability. He didn't cover it. He let it stay. I know, he said. His voice was different, lower, the register he used when there was no performance in it. I'm sorry. She nodded. She didn't say it's fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and he deserved the honesty of that. And she didn't say it's okay because she had spent her whole life telling people things were okay when they weren't, and she was done with that particular habit. She stood up. She crossed the distance between the chair and the bed, 4 steps, the longest 4 steps she'd taken in 3 weeks, and she sat on the edge of the bed beside him, and she held out her hand, palm up. He looked at it. He looked at her. He put his hand in hers. His knuckles were bruised. She didn't ask. From what she already knew, there had been a period of about 4 minutes at the gala between the shots in the car where Adrian had handled things she hadn't seen directly and had chosen not to examine too closely. His hand was large and warm, and she could feel the ridges of the tattoos under her fingers, the scar tissue along the edge of his palm from something old. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They sat like that for a while. It was Vera who finally interrupted a soft knock. The door opened 3 inches. Vera's voice precise and apologetic. I'm sorry, there's a call. It's Dominic. He says it won't hold. Adrian's hand tightened on Alaina's just for a second. Then he exhaled. Give me 5 minutes, he said. Vera withdrew. Alaina started to pull her hand back, and he held it. Not hard, just held it. Dominic is my second, he said. He was at the gala. He's been managing containment since we left. Go, she said, in a minute. He looked at her, really looked the way he had looked at her maybe twice in the entire 3 weeks they'd been married, the way that didn't feel like assessment or strategy, but just like sight, like he was actually looking at the person in front of him and not what she represented. I need to tell you something. She waited. When I married you, he said, it was the most controlled decision I had made in a decade. Every variable accounted for, every angle considered. He paused. I was wrong about one variable. She kept her face steady. Her pulse was not steady. Which one? You, he said simply. I thought you were a circumstance, something to be managed and accounted for and kept at a functional distance. His jaw moved. You are not a circumstance. The room was very quiet. No, she agreed. I'm not. He lifted her hand slightly, both of them looking at it, his fingers around hers, the strange, ordinary intimacy of it. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is, I'm aware that's not a particularly reassuring thing to say. It's honest, she said. Honest is better. I've been building walls long enough that I'm not certain I remember what's on the other side of them. I know what's on the other side, she said. He looked up at her. I've been watching you for 3 weeks, she said, through the walls. She turned her hand over so their palms were properly aligned, fingers interlaced. You're in there. You're just out of practice. Something crossed his face, pain maybe, or the thing that lives right next to pain when you've spent a long time deciding you don't have access to it. He exhaled slowly like a man setting something heavy down after a very long walk. Alaina, he said. Go take your call, she said. I'll be here. He looked at her for one more moment, Then he nodded, and she released his hand, and he reached for his phone with the other one and was already moving back into the controlled register by the time he'd crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the low murmur of his voice and understood something that she hadn't let herself understand before. Not because she hadn't known it, because knowing something and allowing yourself to know it were two entirely different acts requiring two entirely different kinds of courage. She was not surviving this anymore. She had stopped surviving this probably around the time he passed her the bread without being asked, or maybe the night he texted functional at 11:13, or maybe as far back as the gala when he'd put her behind him before she even registered the shot. She had stopped surviving it and started living inside it, and the difference between those two things was vast and irreversible and terrifying in the specific way that real things were terrifying. Not the theatrical fear of danger or threat, the quiet bone-level fear of mattering to someone and letting them matter back. His call lasted 12 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the wall with the same focused attention she used to give to her father's business calls when she was young and afraid, and trying to gauge from pitch and duration how bad the night was going to be. Old habit. She wasn't afraid now. She was something else. Something she didn't have a complete vocabulary for yet. He came back. He stood in the doorway and said, "Mira's gone quiet." She looked up. "Since when?" "Since 2 hours ago. Dominic has been tracking her communications through a channel I won't explain. She's gone completely silent." He came back into the room. "That either means she's retreating or she's switching tactics." "Or both," Alaina said. "Or both," he agreed. "What does Dominic think?" "Dominic thinks she's cutting losses." He sat in the chair, her chair, the one she'd occupied for the past hour, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "If the contract is airtight and the shooting failed to create the pressure she needed, the cost-benefit tilts. Miraven is many things. Irrational is not one of them. So it might be over. This phase," he said carefully, "this particular approach, whether she returns to it in another form," he spread one hand, a rare open gesture. "I can't promise it ends here." "I know." She folded her arms, not defensively, just settled. "I'm not asking for promises, I'm asking for the truth." He looked at her steadily. "The truth is that I live in a world where this will happen again. Some version of it. Someone will always be applying pressure to something, and some of that pressure will find the people near me." He held her gaze. "The truth is that knowing that and choosing to stay anyway is not a small thing. I don't want you to make it a small thing." The directness of it hit her somewhere central. Because it wasn't a manipulation. It wasn't the careful framing of a man trying to manage an outcome. It was a man telling her the actual cost of a thing and making sure she'd seen the price tag before she decided. "I've never made anything small," she said. "That's not how I'm built." He studied her. "No," he said, "it's not. My mother asked me once, she said whether you were unkind." She paused. "I told her no. I told her unkind and good weren't the same thing." He was very still. "What would you tell her now?" She thought about it honestly. About the chapel and the man on the floor. About the contract and the timing. About the way he'd moved her in the dark before she'd even understood there was something to move from. About his hand in hers and the walls he'd admitted to, and the word functional sent at 11:13 in the morning, no at night, and then her correcting herself, and how even that felt like something now. "I'd tell her," she said slowly, "that I married a man who is very good at being dangerous, and that somewhere inside the dangerous, there is something worth knowing." She met his eyes. "And that I've decided to know it." He didn't move for a moment. Then he stood up from the chair, crossed the room, and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, the same configuration she had made an hour ago when she held out her hand. He didn't take her hand this time. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked at the wall ahead of them, and he said, "I've been alone in this building for 6 years." "I know," she said. "I forgot what it felt like to have someone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock. Is that what this is?" She kept her voice light, but she meant the question. He turned his head to look at her, closer than they had been deliberately before, without the cover of performance or a crowded room or the choreography of a public marriage. Just the two of them in a quiet room with the truth of the last 3 weeks sitting between them, smaller than she'd expected and heavier in a better way. "No," he said, "it's not just that." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. I don't have the right word for it yet, he said. I'm working on it. She nodded. Take your time. I will, he said, and then quieter. Thank you for staying in the room. She understood he didn't mean the medical suite. She understood he meant something larger, the chapel, the contract, the gala, the 3 weeks of careful distance, closing inch by inch into something that neither of them had planned for, and both of them had arrived at anyway. She understood he meant all of it. I wasn't going anywhere, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then he looked back at the wall. And they sat together in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something and come out the other side not unscathed but intact, which was better actually than unscathed because you couldn't build on untested ground, and everything they had now had been tested and had held. Vera brought tea at some point. Neither of them had asked for it. Vera simply knew the way Vera always knew and set it on the table without a word and withdrew. And Alaina picked up her cup and Adrian picked up his, and they sat in the quiet of the penthouse on a Friday night with the city 40 floors below them and 3 weeks of a marriage that had become without either of them approving it in advance. Something real. She had walked into an empty chapel in her mother's earrings with a pen in her hand and a contract on the altar and a man in a dark suit who hadn't even looked at her face. She had signed her name on a document that was supposed to mean nothing more than the sum of its terms. She had done all of it with her eyes open and her jaw set in the clear-eyed, practical resignation of a woman who had grown up knowing that the world charged what it charged, and the only dignity available was in paying the price without flinching. She had not planned on this, on him, on the bread passed without being asked, in the text at 11:13, in the hand in the dark that had found her before she knew she needed finding. She had not planned on sitting in this room at this hour feeling of all the improbable things like herself. But that was the thing about plans. They accounted for the variables you knew. They couldn't account for the ones that turned out to be people. Adrian Voss set down his tea. He reached over, without looking, and his hand covered hers where it rested on the bed between them. Not a grip, not a strategy, just a hand. She turned hers over and held it. Outside, the city went on. Loud and indifferent and alive. Inside, in the quiet of a room, neither of them had expected to be sharing something that had started as a signature on a piece of paper had become against every odd and every design and every careful, controlled intention a beginning. Not perfect, not safe, not the version of a life that came with guarantees or soft edges or mornings that didn't require vigilance, but real, fully, irreversibly, undeniably real. And for two people who had spent most of their lives managing the distance between themselves and everything that mattered, real was not nothing. Real was everything.